All right, Robin Thurston, it is a pleasure to have you on the Single Track podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the way I see it, Outside Media is without a doubt the biggest media company in our space, I think by orders of magnitude. And I'm really excited to talk about what you have in the works for my community in particular, which is the trail and ultra running world. But I do want to touch on a few things before that. I know just from going back on interviews you've done in the past that you were at the forefront of what we'll call the connected fitness movement back in the mid 2000s. And I'm wondering, just to set the table here, can you go into detail about what that was like and maybe start with like the genesis of MapMyRun, for example?
Yeah. So I've been in and around cycling and endurance sports really my whole life. Started bike racing when I was like 8, 9 years old. Grew up in Colorado, fortunately, because we had the Red Zinger Mini Classic in the 80s, which was like a huge deal for kids my age at that time. And, just got lucky in that the environment in Colorado was very much one that sort of helped grow young cyclists into, sort of thinking about it from a professional cycling career. So that was fortunate. I went to Europe. I raced for a few years. I always say that I was a good cyclist. I wasn't a great cyclist. And so my reality set in by 94. And I had a bad crash. I went through the back windshield of a team car at about 40 miles an hour, no helmet. So that reality set in too. But when I got back to the States, I studied finance, and I was fortunate enough to get a job at Reuters, and the company that I was working for got purchased by Reuters, and then we started building some direct-to-consumer subscriptions using credit cards in the late 90s. I was part of the Reuters.com team launch in the early 2000s, and sort of learned the ad business and sort of about product and digital product a lot more even in the early 2000s, and then. I was on a cycling trip in 2005, and somebody at dinner just said something really funny. We were in Switzerland near where I lived, and they said, "Oh, it'd be cool if I could come back to Switzerland and know the roads without you being here." And I was like, there's travel books, but there's no way for me to actually create a route and then send it to you, Finn. And so that kicked off the whole idea for MapMy. My partner, Kevin Callahan, actually now works with Outside now too. So my partner in MapMy has come back to join me at Outside and is running some of our digital product initiatives here. And so, we were fortunate. We had about 1 million users on the web between MapMyRun and MapMyRide before the iPhone launched. And then in 2008, in July, in the summer, we made a pretty, I'd say important decision in that we launched iPhone apps in the App Store in July. And so we had 2 of the first 100 iPhone apps, which was, really historic if you think about it. I mean, the timing, people think it just kind of blew up into the right, and that was during the financial crisis, and there was a bunch of stuff going on. But we got featured by AT&T in November 2008, and it really was up into the right. We were on every major publication. Our app was on the iPhone. And so I don't want to say the rest is history, but we got really fortunate in terms of timing, really focusing on consumer needs. Like we would do this thing where we would come in on Monday mornings and we would look through Zendesk, or at the time we were using some other software for customer service, and we'd pick off the top 3 issues that were reported over the weekend, and we'd summarize them, and then the teams would develop those that week, and then we'd release them before the end of the weekend and see what happens the next weekend. So we did that sort of consecutively for years. MapMyRun still to this day is probably one of the top running communities. The map behind me is a map of all start locations in 2014, which is about 300 million workouts around the globe. And so timing was great with MapMy. Obviously, when Under Armour bought it, that was a big win for us. Validation, I always say, for an entrepreneur is when somebody says, "Here's what your company's worth," and you go through that process. And it was really great. And I loved working at Under Armour for 3 years, and with Kevin Plank. And at the end, it was a lot. I mean, it kind of relates to the story of Outside, which was that, we had this huge connected fitness base. We had, MyFitnessPal, we had Endomondo in Europe, we had MapMy, we had 8 other companies that we had all put together. Another product we had launched called Record. We had hardware with the, Under Armour Hover platform. We had launched HealthBox in the hardware space with HTC. But I really felt like the big missing component was content. Like I was like, hey, we can have a much more vibrant base if we start really producing content. And unfortunately, at that time in 2016, the company it was under a little bit of stress. And so, basically I left. I had a non-compete for a couple of years. So I went to run a consumer genetics company, which is a whole nother story on its own. Also in the quantified space area, by the way, though, it was very parallel in many respects. But I really started thinking a lot about how would I get back into the category? How would I think about coming back in and doing something meaningful? We just got, we started with the endurance brands like Velo News and Women's Running and Podium and Triathlete. And then we kind of stepped into some bigger assets with active interest media with, Ski Magazine and Backpacker and Yoga Journal and Clean Eating and Warren Miller Films and some other things. And then we bought Big Stone up in Carbondale that owned Rock and Ice and Trail Runner. First non-media business was Finisher Picks, which was on the event photography side. And then, I'd say we got lucky in that I had met Larry Burke. My mom lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I had gone to lunch with him in 2019. And I'd sort of jokingly said to him, hey, Larry, if you ever want to sell outside, give me a call. And he called me a year later at Thanksgiving. And he said, hey, we have this TV network that's called Outside Television. Would you want to buy that? And I said, well, it's interesting, but I'm not really interested unless I own the brand. And he kind of scuffed at me a little bit and said, I'm not sure I'm ready to sell Outside Magazine. And then a week later, he called me back and said, look, I'm 78 years old and I think I'm ready to get out of it. And so that was our sort of catalyst to being able to acquire, Outside and Gaia GPS. And we did a whole bunch of other acquisitions like Athlete Reg and some other things at the same time. And then literally less than 6 months later, Pink Bike called me and said, hey, there's a big, we've seen what you guys have done. Are you interested in putting Pink Bike and Trail Forks and Cycling Tips and the Pink Bike marketplace all together? And so it just kind of all came together. I mean, I don't want to say it was all perfectly thought out. It wasn't, there was a lot of serendipity and things that had to come together. And obviously we have a big base of, almost 80 million customers touch us monthly. And, I think the thing I worry most about is probably how to retain the authenticity of these deep verticals that, we're in. And I think a lot about it because I think about it as a user, as a cyclist, and how do I keep that authenticity without making it feel generic? How do I keep developing the features on apps? Like I love Trail Forks. It was one of the reasons I was so excited to get it. I mountain bike and gravel a lot. And, I would say that, it's probably the second or third most highest app I use on my phone. And, so that like keeping those things and really developing those communities around those products is probably the thing that I think about the most. And maybe what I'm most concerned about as we continue to scale.
Oh, awesome. Well, there's a couple of things you mentioned there that I want to go into. I want to talk a bit more about your time at Under Armour with Kevin, and you mentioned quantified self. And honestly, one of the biggest conversations that we've had to date on this podcast is what you said perfectly, which is how do you retain authenticity of these deep verticals post-acquisition? And there's a lot of fans of this pod that are subscribers and contributors to fastestknowntime.com, for example, which you acquired earlier this year. But I want to ask a couple of questions about connected fitness before we go on. We are 16, 17 years past the founding of MapMyRun. I think it's still the largest running community in the world to date. There's other companies now like Strava, which I know you've called the greatest training log of all time.
Well, I give them more credit than that now, but I think that they, in some ways, I could give a whole bunch of analogies. I think what Michael and Mark have built is amazing, and I'm a user, and I think we look forward to more partnerships with them. When I was at MapMy, I would say I certainly had my moments of like wanting to be very competitive was maybe the right way to put it.
Yeah.
But I admire what they've built for sure.
I guess my question here is, if you think about the movement as a whole, what inning are we in? Like, what figurative inning are we in? How much progress has been made? Like, I know that that's a subjective question with a subjective answer, but you're right there. So what are your thoughts? Like, how much progress has been made?
So what inning do I think we're in? So I would say it started before 2005. Mobile, certainly 2008 was a huge catalyst for quantified self, or what, today is just called, active lifestyle, data, or whatever you want to call it now. Because I go back to like the early 90s or the 80s, like I was literally writing stuff in books. And then when spreadsheets came out, I had everything in spreadsheets. And I used to say at MapMy that our greatest competitor was Excel. Like that's what people, like we were trying to get people off of Excel for a long time, right? So there was a stat I think that Apple gave on the call, or it was maybe like in a post report, that they estimate that 60% of the U.S. population will track some sort of health data by 2025. Right. So this is watch adoption. It's, app adoption. It's moving from, written down to being in the cloud type of data storage. The thing that I think is so interesting about the category is that it's one category. Like I'm using an example. How many golf rounds are tracked is like probably less than 5%. How many, like when you think about the attendance of a sports game. So like, I'm using an example like, you're at the Broncos game or something. Yeah. Actually knowing the person that's in the seat, that like the ticket wasn't resold or whatever, is, you don't have 100%. Maybe you got 50% of the audience that you actually know their email or whatever. But you don't know that much about them. You don't know, like, do they play football outside? Do they run? Do they ride? Like, what do they do outside of, going to the sporting event? So I think what's interesting about our category is that so many people, for what I would call the reward of visualization, so like seeing it in your training calendar or seeing it on a map, is a huge incentive, or seeing the rings close on your Apple Watch, right, is a huge incentive. What I think that is missing is the true reward cycle. So like when you go do that thing, that there is an immediate benefit for doing it, like airline miles or American Express points, or and I think there are some interesting companies coming into the category. It's something we think about a lot in terms of rewards, because I think that there are a lot of, like, take games as an example. There's a lot of embedded reward systems that are driving people to play those games. And I think that companies like Outside and other people in the space have to start thinking about, how do we sort of like mano a mano with the things that are drawing people in that are, I would argue, negative for them. Any screen time to me is not positive for our health. Even doing this with you on this call, no offense, but like, you're not helping my health right now by doing this, right? So, I think that's where I think we have to start using any framework, and that's a little bit why we decided to get into Web3 a little bit. We're testing some things there. I think we have to use all possible technology and services and word of mouth and community engagement and everything to create reward systems that compete with the dopamine response of TikTok or Instagram or the video games that you play. I watch my own 3 kids. I have a 6, 9, and 11-year-old, and I'm frankly terrified. I'm terrified at how much I see these screens pull them in. They don't have phones yet, even my 11-year-old. But it's really, really, really challenging. I can see the dopamine response. I can see the way they act after they're on screens. And it's frankly terrifying, if you ask me.
And I do want to have a very large conversation about screen time later in this episode. But you said that what was missing there, at least in our outdoor space, is the quote unquote true reward cycle. And we don't have the equivalent of these American Express points and reward miles. Is this where the promise of NFTs can take over?
Well, it's sort of interesting watching, like, I don't know if you saw what Starbucks launched today, or I think it's called Odyssey, around their rewards program. And they're not even calling it NFTs. I think there's a little bit of negative connotation with NFTs, which I understand. There's been, variety of things happen in the space. But I think what's interesting is the future of rewards that are, very, very dynamic. And I think that when you look at the gaming platforms, they're looking very closely at Web3, because when you have transferable assets that are collectible, that are real time, that are they're tradable. In other words, there's like a market value for them, like a speculative market value for them.
Yeah.
I would argue too, by the way, I think that American Express and most of the mileage programs will be on open public blockchains, so that you and I, through a smart contract, could decide to exchange miles, like literally in real time. Like I could be like, hey, Finn, I need your 100,000 miles for this trip that I want to take tomorrow. How much are you willing to sell them for? Same thing with American Express points. I think all of those things, because market dynamics and frankly, the stock market and other types of instruments have proved this, is that when you combine speculation with long-term holders, there is a dynamic that's created from an open marketplace perspective. There's a dynamic that's created that's very unique. And sometimes there's bad stuff that happens, but sometimes there's really good stuff that happens. But most of all, there's price appreciation, which I think is very unique, specifically to our category in the long run. So I don't really hinge on the word NFTs, but I think that the technology around Web3 is extremely interesting to build reward platforms that will motivate humans to do different things around incentives that are, sort of important to them.
Okay, I cannot wait to talk about that. I'm going to bookmark it. But I gotta ask you this, because I am an e-commerce nerd, and I know that one of your greatest contributions at Under Armour was the institution of these quote unquote microtransactions. So for listeners that aren't familiar, if you ran like 100 miles on the MapMyRun app, for example, you might in exchange get like 40% off some Under Armour shoes. And I've always been curious, where did this idea come from? Was there precedent for it? What prompted you to bring this to the table?
Oh yeah, I mean, I didn't invent that. I would say we executed it pretty well, not even as well as I wanted it to be. But I think when you looked at what Nike was doing, they had started to layer some of that stuff in Training Club and some other things. I think there's lots of models in e-commerce where there are what I call sort of incentive-driven models. So like I use a friend of mine, David Cravens at Zulily. Okay. He, Daryl Cravens, sorry. Daryl put in this thing where like if you were at Zulily a certain amount of times that you would get a discount. So like, linking outdoor activity to a discount on Under Armour, like I said, wasn't really new. It was just in how we did it and how we executed it. And what we saw was that if we went to purchase a customer, like what I would call rent a customer from Facebook or Instagram, that customer might come to Under Armour's site 2 times a year, and the average order value might be like $100 and $110. When we did it to the Connected Fitness community, we were seeing 3 times a year visits on average, and we were seeing like cart average order values like could be close to $200. And so I think that was where we realized that there was a lot of value in offering those microtransactions and keeping people on the platform longer. If you ask me, I mean, I think if you listen to Amazon's earning call, or like, I don't know if you saw this big deal this week with Paramount Plus and Walmart. Yeah. But I think all of these things are tied into, Amazon already has a huge amount of data from last year on Thursday Night Football watchers about what they converted into, over time on Prime in terms of transactional amounts, and, what that audience is worth in terms of the spend. That, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of $1 million for Thursday Night Football, right? They've already made their money back on that. So I think this idea that content or utilities or the I think, let me put it this way. I believe that in the near future, every business will have a content and a larger investment in content that's linked directly to their commerce in one form or another.
How might this, and I apologize if I've overlooked it, but have you already started to experiment with this at Outside?
Yeah, so we have something called the Outside Shop. We bought a small company called Karen. I would say that our focus has been on the personalization layer related to content and, again, acquiring more, film, TV, obviously premium written content, podcasts that we've been rolling out, as well as like how to link people into Gaia and Trailforks as a benefit to Outside Plus. But in the long run, so we haven't done a ton of testing yet, but I would say in the long run, I'm a huge believer that whether we do that through partnership or we do it directly, I'm a huge believer that this is going to be a massive component of kind of how we think about the world and how we give rewards. Because, my view is like, let me use an example. You let's say use Trailforks for the next 3 months, every mountain bike ride you do. And then I'm sending you something that says like, I could send you something simple like here's 50% off or $50 off of your next Pink Bike gear, purchase, which is obviously we have a Pink Bike store and sell a fair amount of gear through Pink Bike. That's a benefit to you, right? Immediately $50 off just because you logged on Trailforks. You were going to do that anyway. So if now all of a sudden I'm giving you $50 of value right away, that's a benefit. I think there are many partners that you'll see us do that with and other offers. Like, you look at the Grubhub, sort of like Uber Wars, and you're seeing all these partners layer Grubhub and Uber into their offerings. That's all about linking the customer's sort of activity with ultimately a transaction.
Yeah. Well, I think from a media / marketing company standpoint, in my opinion, one of the great questions of our time is, what is valuable enough to put a price tag on? Or should all content be ungated and free? And should we just exalt like the flow of ideas? And where I'm going with this is, if you do what you just described, which is building utility into consumption, and the promise of once you pay for this content, there's going to be other benefits down the road after you've consumed it, is that maybe the play here?
Well, I have a bunch of you. I mean, this category is in some ways, well, I would say all media in some ways has been, what's the right word? I feel like, I mean, if you look at the media business overall, it's been under tremendous pressure the last 15 years. And really the last 10, even more so, as social media really has exploded, right? So let me use an example of like why I don't think all media should be free. Let me just give you an example. Okay. So we write, we write a lot of gear reviews, like thousands and thousands of gear reviews a year. Historically, before there was social media, those reviews were paid for by the advertising that the endemic partners, the Specialized, the SRAMs, the Shimanos of the world, right? And while those advertisers are still with us, they don't spend as much as they used to, and they still expect that those reviews are going to get written. In other words, like every single time a bike comes in or a part comes in or a helmet comes in or whatever it is, that it's going to get a full review by the editorial staff, right? And the reality is that, like, whether you want to talk about it in cost per 1,000 impressions, or you want to talk about it in page rates for, Outside Magazine full page ads, or you want to talk about it in any number of sort of vectors, the reality is that the income generated today from those reviews is significantly less than it was a decade ago. Significantly, right? So, the reality is that what's happened is so let me use an example. So, we, the media, and I mean this very broadly, the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to Outside, have become reliant on posting the links in social media to drive traffic, right? Well, what happens is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they go to those brands and they say, you don't need to buy advertising from Outside. You can just get the traffic on our site from the links that have been posted up. And so you might see a specialized ad next to a link on Facebook, and that's where they're buying their media instead of buying it directly from us. That's one example. Another example is that, like, I'm using an example recently. Somebody was like, why don't you have a team of people on the ground covering this very, very prominent event, right? In the endurance space.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I'd love to have 5 people on the ground for every single event. I would love to. But the reality is Our partners, when they spend money in social media to gain access to our audience, are not funding us to be able to be on the ground basically doing that event, right? Like to do the coverage. So we have to do it remote, very quickly, watching TV, whatever it might be. And so I think fundamentally this is the problem that media has, and outdoor media is no different. So one thing to be clear with your listeners, media does not support the cost of the outside business. We have got to think about membership. We have got to think about things like Trail Forks and Gaia subscribers as part of, the Outside Plus membership. So make no mistake, what used to pay for all of the content that we produce is no longer supporting that same amount of content to be produced, right? So we have very hard decisions to make in real time, and part of it is still being funded by what I'd call the consumer now, which is through the membership. So those memberships are incredibly important to us as part of our way to build and storytell and talk about these things, because what I call traditional digital media or print media or video media is not right now supporting the full cost of our content that we develop. So that's my answer to your question is no, I do not think all media will be free.
It seems to me that a lot of consumers had no problem in the Web 2 world of being the product, like being this captive audience for advertisers to get in front of. I mean, there are a lot of obvious exceptions of people saying, I hate that this is the case, but it seems like more people balk at the idea of having to pay, let's just say $4 a month for a membership to all this premium content. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that's the case and how long it might take for there to be this sort of crossing of the chasm where people just take it as like, this is just something that we do now as a way to get the content that we want.
I think you're going to start seeing, so one of the things I think is so material about Web3 is this sort of shift of who owns your data. Like you own your data. And my view is that's the way the world should be. And that's one of the things I think is so intriguing. I think you're going to see a lot of what I call micro gating. So it could be you have to, own a certain asset, digital asset to get access to things. You might be able to do that on a per article basis or a per film basis. Think about it more like pay-per-view, right? Like, hey, you just want to watch the boxing match on Friday night. That's going to cost you X to get access to it. Versus a membership where you kind of have this sort of continuum of you're always paying even though you don't know if you're going to use it or not. And by the way, I don't think advertising is ever going away. So the point being is that I think it's going to be some mix of micro access, membership, and advertising. But I think that in the long run, the rebellion from the major tech platforms is going to be about data ownership, and you're right to pull it back easily. And, that's something that we talk about as a team, product teams talk about and stuff. I don't let me use an example, even your Trail Forks data, I'm assuming you're a Trail Forks user. I don't think I own it. I don't think I think I should be able to, I have to always provide benefit to you to have access to it. Now, right now, technically the terms of service say I own it, but I think in the long run, when we think about the development of the product, I think that it will be much more about you owning it and deciding when you either want to let me have access to it or not, and the uses of access to it, if that makes sense.
Well, one thing, and I want to make sure I don't forget to bring this up, but one of the things that I've admired about you and your team, and I know you've been very public about this, is, and you said it earlier in the conversation, you're trying to build a business model that is not reliant on screen time, which is a huge zag away from all these major tech platforms. And you're trying to elevate the discussion. So you're not trying to be reliant on impressions and clickbaity titles and just generally shallow content. But at the same time, I mean, I think earlier this year, I think you had to lay off 15% of the staff. And is that an indictment against this optimistic vision of the future for outdoor media? Or are you confident that that your vision is actually going to play out?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let's see. So the first thing I would say is that it was a very difficult, like, I'm using an example. I'm a 35-year subscriber of Vela News. Literally, like I've been getting it in my mail for 35 years. That's a long time, right? It was a very, very hard decision to look at the dynamics of print. So let me just use a couple of factors that have happened over the last decade. You're talking about double-digit declines year over year in subscribers to print magazines. You have a massive reduction in the page rate pricing that we could charge advertisers. The third thing is that most of the vertical books, with the exception of Outside Magazine, i.e. we did not eliminate Outside Magazine to be 100% clear, but most of the vertical books, like Ski, Vela News, etc., were down. In most cases, they had less than 50% fill rates on advertising in them, right? And paper costs up 300%, as well as our commitment to sustainability, right? Like, don't get me wrong, like the least sustainable thing that we were doing was sending out print magazines, right? So when I layered all those factors in, as well as what was changing in the markets very rapidly, I would have liked more time to figure out if there was some way to keep or distribute print in a different way. But the reality is like, look at what's happening in the markets. Like, we just didn't have time. And so, we had to make that incredibly hard decision, which impacted, a fair number of the staff. And, I've had, obviously some of our team understand, some of them don't, some of the industry people do, some of them don't. You will never catch me on record. You have some people in the industry that have attacked me personally over it. You will never see me do that to anyone in the outdoor industry, because to me, we need every single advocate of the outdoor industry to get people outside. Like, I'm never going to go after someone and be like, that's a terrible publication, or why are they saying that, or this? Because to me, that is just hurting our industry in and itself. So why would I do that? Why would I hurt somebody that's actually advocating for people spending time outdoors, right? Yeah. Whether or not the vision of creating this like almost hub for, what we've sort of rebranded it to Inspire. So our first goal is to inspire you. The second part is to activate you. So like, how do I get you to an event? How do I get you on a trip? How do I get you using Trailforks or Gaia so that you're actually out there doing it? And I can sort of create micro things to want you to do that more. And then ultimately reward. And so can I say for sure right now, especially in the climate that we're in, and I would say the massive headwinds against media and businesses in general, this has nothing to do with the outdoor industry. This is like the climate that we're in. Can I say for sure that I think our vision will, make it to the ultimate point that I have in my head? No, I can't say that for sure today. What people on the podcast should know is I will do everything in my power to make sure that we get to that experience that I ultimately view. I'm super excited. Our new app is coming out, which is an aggregation across the platform in Q4. We have some incredible things that are coming in Q1 that are sort of the next layer of it that I'm really excited about. That is the first time you will see the culmination of my vision to begin with will likely be by the end of Q1 or early in Q2 of next year, as we've brought all these pieces together. Do I know yet whether or not consumers are going to adopt that in mass? I don't know yet, but I have a good track record in building things for consumers that a lot of people, i.e. the map behind me, have used. And so I'm very hopeful that will be the case as we roll this out.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't know why I'm reminded of it in this moment, but it could have been because
by the way, I might have just done that thing where I product release something on your show that no one knows about. So, you can highlight it that way later if you want.
Right on. Well, hey, I should say this. I think it was you actually that made an interesting point that the way Web 2 is set up as it stands today, a lot of these outdoor companies, the North Face, Patagonia, anybody that advertises on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc., in essence, they're funding their own demise because they are contributing money to platforms that incentivize users to just stay on their screens and not to go buy that North Face jacket that would allow them to go ski for the day at I'm looking at Alta outside in my
Yeah.
hometown of Salt Lake City.
Yeah. It's terrifying. Like,
how do you pivot people? Like, how do you rally the industry?
Incentive, it kind of goes back to like one of the reasons why I'm so intrigued by Web3 and the incentive layers that are there, and the potential reward layers. But, it's kind of like, if you think about the spending, I don't want to get into politics, but if you think about like basically the budgets on both the Republican and the Democrat side, everybody's spending too much money. Like, let's just be clear. Like, why do we have massive inflation? It's because we printed too much money and that money got spent and government spent it and we spent it and all of these things. But, when you have incentives that are set up very short term, like in other words, like you are a leader at an outdoor company selling physical good, and you got to get that stuff sold in this quarter because your public announcement is going to be about how you did this quarter. You make trade-offs. And I don't like, whenever I say this about these companies, because by the way, I post links for stories on social media. I'm helping it too, right? I'm not saying that there is a, the incentive is very, very strong to do that because of how trackable, traceable everything it is. But I just think that companies in our space should realize that there is an inevitability here that is very concerning, around everything from mental health to outdoor time to the future of VR is incredibly scary to me. Like, I got people emailing me every day like, hey, I have a really cool mountain bike experience in VR. Like, you guys should really talk about integrating this in your platform. And I'm thinking to myself, is that what I want? Is that what I want? Which is like you on a headset thinking that you're doing like I was just at Mountain Bike Worlds in Leger, which was incredible, by the way. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, do I want someone to be thinking about recreating going down the, downhill in VR and only doing that and not getting on an actual mountain bike? That's not really what I want. So that concerns me. And I think that companies in our space should be thinking about it. They should be concerned about it. But I understand that the balance is there's short-term needs and incentives that drive a lot of the decisions.
I think this is a perfect place to finally come around to the screen time conversation. You've coined a phrase called the Outerverse, which contrasts with the popular metaverse phrase in our tech world. And I think you've already explained why, but I guess talk about the distinction here and from a philosophical standpoint, maybe talk about just what you're concerned about when it comes to the internet these days, VR included.
Yeah, I mean, there are some stats. We have some partners, and obviously we publish stories and do research on this. But I mean, I'm extremely concerned that and again, my own sort of like real world experiences watching my own kids and trying to always like push them to go outside and spend more time with their friends and things like that. And I think that when you look at the minimum clinical requirement for outdoor time for healthy lifestyle is 130 minutes, which to me seems ridiculously low, to be clear, in a week, right? But when you think about that, the average American kid is getting less than 60 minutes a week outdoors, that's frightening to me compared to when I was a kid and thinking about the benefits that I got from, exploring the outdoors and being able to ride my bike anywhere. And, so there's like going back to the short-term incentives, when you think about COVID, everybody in the outdoor industry was talking about like, are there too many people in the outdoors? Like, look at our parks. They're all dirty and people don't know how to use the trails and, all these things. And I go, that is a solvable problem. If there's no one on those trails, that's a totally different problem. Like, I would rather solve cleaning up the trails and having too many people on them. So during COVID, obviously there was a big accelerant or what looked like a big, sort of demand burst. And I think with population growth, there's going to be a certain segment of our population that is thinking about outdoor time. But when you look at the overall health trends globally, And I think screen time is a major contributor to diabetes, heart disease, all of these things. And I think eventually we will figure out the link. I am downright terrified. And so when we were looking specifically at Web3, we were asking ourselves the questions of like, can we use this technology to create a different incentive, which is, can we use it to unlock rewards for spending time outdoors? And I think that everything you see that we'll be trying to do will be in that vein. We'll be in trying to create real world experiences. Like I always use Niantic as an example with Pokemon Go, and even what they're doing most recently with the NBA. They're creating this like outdoor engagement game from all the basketball courts, outdoor basketball courts in the U.S. And those are the types of things that I would like to see a lot more of. Like I love AR because you can use it in real world outdoor experiences. We're quite close with Zwift and Eric Min, and I'm while again I would prefer people be outdoors, I do think there are benefits to the type of thing like the esport like actual activity that they're creating and others in the category like Rovi and Wahoo and other people are doing. But like again, the trends are all against this, like globally. It's not just in the US. This is the dopamine response to you and I being on a screen, and especially for younger generations, is in my mind worse than smoking. And I don't like. I'm going to try everything I can to try to get people to realize they should be outdoors, in any fashion. I frankly don't care if you're golfing. I don't care if you're walking around your front lawn with your shoes off. I'm just saying, like, time outdoors, in my opinion, is absolutely essential for your health.
Well, and I'm trying to think of an example that this audience can latch on to. I know you've used the Warren Miller ticket in other conversations, and maybe we can just replay that here. But can you talk about how in this Outerverse world, when you're consuming something that outside offers to you, there are going to be downstream benefits that you get to enjoy 3, 6, 9, 12 months after the fact?
Yeah. So, I mean, since we're, probably talking to a mountain bike audience, let's use like what I envision for trail forks in the long run as a good example. So, my hope is that soon we will have a way for, as you collect miles and do more miles in trail forks, or even certain trails or certain challenges that you might do, that those would unlock rewards that are only accessible to people that do more and more on the platform. And so we're connecting getting outdoors and doing real world, in this case, mountain biking through trail forks or hiking or whatever you want to record in their Gaia, that it's specifically linked to unlocking some experience. Like maybe I use a good example. So like one thing I would like to do is, like, let's say our top, sort of producers or people that are riding the most in trail forks, maybe there are different unlock levels. Like maybe the people that are, logging 100 plus rides a year get entered into going to World Mountain Bike with our editors and having a really in-depth experience around seeing the best of the best, participate in mountain biking. Or maybe there's like a really amazing trip to Cape Epic with a group of, elite athletes that are like your domestiques for the week for Cape Epic because of that. Like those are the things I'd like to see. But also, like, for the person that logs the first ride on trail forks, like maybe after you do your first 10 miles, it unlocks something that triggers like you getting a really cool discount on a new bag or pink bike product or whatever it is. And then that makes you want to go ride the next 10 miles because that might unlock something else. So I see it all the way from the people that are doing the most to the people that are just entering that life cycle and really trying direct rewards to something that would be meaningful to them, in the space. And again, I see it very much like a little bit like, American Express Rewards or United Miles or something, where you're going into kind of like a store and you get to pick from things that might be meaningful to you over time. It could be partners, it could be experiences, it could be, other things. And I think that's really the future that I see around every single thing that is about really linked to, people spending time outdoors or doing the activity that they love. Because I think the counter cycle that is, if you think about a young kid, if they're getting massive rewards in the next gaming experience, Fortnite or whatever, what happens if they decide to play Fortnite all the time instead of go for a mountain bike ride? So I think we have to create parallel experiences, not just for the riders of today, but the future generation of riders. And that's what I would just say that we're going to be focusing a lot on here at Outside.
Well, I know we are coming up on the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I just have two more questions for you. The first, I'll preface with a comment. It seems to me like when you think about bundling versus unbundling of products and services, it seems like we're in this period of bundling in the outdoor media space. You just recently acquired fastestknowntime.com. Lola Digital Media just acquired iRunFar. The reason I bring those two up is there are a lot of people in our community, right or wrong, they have very strong anti-authoritarian streaks, anti-commercialization streaks. When you acquire those companies, what steps do you take to preserve the quality and the trust and the authenticity that these brands developed over the years with those audiences?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say that there's always going to be some level of change. I mean, the way that I've thought about, I was part of a lot of acquisitions at Reuters in the sort of financial services space, and they also had communities around them. Certainly with Under Armour, we did a fair amount of M&A, and we were like really trying to preserve the MyFitnessPal community and that audience that was there, or the Endomondo audience that was in Europe. Fundamentally, I think you will always lose some part of the base that just doesn't believe you're going to take care of the product. And as they see some degradation, or, maybe it's, in our case with content, it's maybe there's an editor that leaves and they're like, but I loved that person. Like, where do they go? And what are they going to do now? I think you're going to have some of that. What I think ultimately you have to do is you have to build a product for them in terms of like developing on top of what's there that was better than what they had before. That's sort of step one. I think if you start to build that, and I understand right now, like, we haven't introduced that product to our audience, so there's a lot of questions about like, what is that going to look like? I think when people see this new product that's coming, I think they'll be like, wow, like, this is a big change. Like, this is something that I really value in terms of aggregating. Like, think about it like, Apple News, or, a really refined, personalized, feed for you that, brings all these pieces together and helps you discover new things. You have to invest and develop in the product so that they're getting more out of it than maybe they were before. And then secondarily, something that we have, I would say, have tried hard to do is invest in the teams. I mean, almost everybody across the organization, we've invested in, their salaries and bonuses and benefits. And, that to me is something that when you're smaller, it's harder to do. We have obviously, have had capital from, the venture world that's allowed us to support, those individuals and hopefully help them grow. But I would say that it does not come without growing pains. Like, there's no way that I could sit here and, Kevin Plank used to use this statement that I loved, which is trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. And I think that, right now, we've spilled some buckets certainly as we've gone along in the process, but we hope we're adding some drops in, and over time we'll add more drops, then we'll spill the buckets.
Last question I have for you. It's probably a little bit self-serving because I probably stand to benefit to some degree, but in this era where, at least in my opinion, it's never been easier for an individual to build an audience, what are the incentives that you're kind of putting in front of people like myself to recruit to create on the Outside platform? And maybe we can talk about this in the context of like this creator marketplace you've talked about in previous interviews.
Yeah, I mean, we have a network of, tens of thousands of freelance writers across the platform that we pay, and we've committed to paying on time, and which not necessarily did the previous owners do in many of these cases. And I still think that model is far from perfect. And what I mean by that is that I think that we should be a platform where you are getting your voice in front of the people that are most relevant to your audience, and that you get to keep the majority of that revenue. But the exchange is that you also don't have to go out, like the portion of revenue we would keep, let's say it's 10, 15%. The portion of revenue we keep is solely because we are giving you an audience that normally you'd have to buy or sort of develop on your own, right? And then we're marketing that over time and giving you access to a bigger platform. So I think when you look at the Substacks and the Patreons and others of the world, I think that is the move that in a new marketplace framework we will eventually get to. To be clear, market conditions, investment cycles, all of these things make a big impact on that because of the capital that you need to be able to do that. But I would say my ultimate goal is to become more of a platform that puts you in front of the right audience in the outdoor category and has you taking the majority of the revenue home, rather than it being like a flat relationship where I pay you a certain amount for an article or a podcast or whatever it is. Again, will it happen overnight? No, but that is certainly the long-term ambition.
Awesome. Well, Robin, I cannot thank you enough for your time. I know that the listeners will enjoy this conversation. I'll make sure to link to all of the relevant social media and initiatives that you have going on at Outside.
Thank you.
But before we go, are there any calls to action that you have for the audience?
Well, I can't leave without saying, the Outside Plus bundle, I think is really the magic that we put together. So, certainly would appreciate the support from people on that front. You can find that at any one of the sites. And, obviously if you're out there mountain biking, love the support for Trail Forks, as it's, it's to me one of the shining stars that we have, and we want to put more resources there. So appreciate the support the community has for paying for that.